Okay, everybody, here we go with our next class of psychological testing and assessment. This is the video lecture. Um, a couple things that I want to bring up regarding the class, or actually about one aspect of the class. I just posted on the discussion board um, a uh, a specific issue related to the exam, and please make sure you read it. I know I said on there, please read ASAP, so I'm hoping everybody saw it. Essentially, this is the issue. I have posted the questions that will be on the TAT exam. So I have posted those. I think I may have misled you previously in thinking that once I posted the questions, you then needed to turn in the test. That is not the case. And I know I said this in the discussion board, but I really want to make sure to drive it home. The exam itself is not due until I believe it's the 13th. It's whatever class we have the week of the 13th. So that'll be 2 weeks from next class. I am submitting to you the test exam questions so that you can start working on them. You do not need to turn them in until the 13th. The reason for that is because you have two things to turn in on the 13th. You have the exam and then your TAT interpretation report. Um, since at least this video lecture and at least part of the next video lecture, I will be talking about interpreting the TAT in more detail. I don't really want you to start working on the interpretation. Well, you also don't have the material for the interpretation report. What I will do is give you a set of TAT responses, and then you will write up your own interpretation response. You don't have those and will not have those until the week before the assignment is due. Uh, but the exam you can start working on now. You are allowed to look stuff up online and make reference to that in your answers. Um, so yeah, so there you go. That is the way that goes. And I know I explained that in the discussion board, but I wanted to explain a little bit more detail here because I'm sure it could be confusing. And again, it's all because the week of the 13th, you have two assignments to turn in. And even though they're both due the same days, and the reason, by the way, I'm having you turn both of them in is you may learn things in the next two video lectures or the next two live lectures or in the readings you have for the next 2 weeks that you want to add to your exam questions. I'm not saying you have to have it done anytime the next 2 weeks. You don't have it done till it's due on the 13th, the exam. But you may want to start working on some of the questions now so that you're not crammed to try to do it all together, between the 6th and the 13th. And that's just the way, it's the way the course works. I want to try to get as much in. The way the video lectures and the live lectures are going to work for the most part is um, the next two video lectures will focus almost exclusively on interpretation of the TAT. And then the next two classes, the live classes, will focus more on projective measures in general, um, based on what you have in the Taglasi book, but then applying it not only to understand the TAT, but also to understanding projective tests in general. Okay, so that is where I want to go, what I wanted to start saying here. And now so what I want to do during this class is I have three TAT cards sitting in front of me. And what I want to do is I'm going to go through each of the sections laid out in the book and that we've been talking about how you interpret the TAT. And I want to go through in a little bit of detail for each card about how you look through for each of those things. So let me start with this one. We've talked a number of times about card number one. That's the kid with the violin. And that was the one that was used in the administration um, example from I think it was our second um, week. So that was card number one. At least the first example was card number one. Card number two, the farm picture, is what you'll see on the exam questions. That's the one I asked about. So I skipped ahead to card number three. It's actually card 3BM. But again, the gender part, a couple of you mentioned this in the discussion board, the gender part of the card, and I know Tiglesi talks about it in the book, really it's only used for reference anymore. It used to be that it was seen that um, uh, three that if it had BM after it, it was more for males. It was geared more towards males. It was more useful to work with for males. And if it had GF after it, it was seen as more um, useful for females. The same way there's the male masculinity femininity scale on the MMPI2, that concept has gone by the wayside. Uh, but the card numbers are still, the designations are still used um, for the most part, just for reference. So the first one I'm going to talk about is this card. So let me put up the screen as much as I can. You have the slides that I gave you. So if you want a closer up look at this picture, go to the TAT slides from the second week. Now, when you see this picture, this is 3BM. One thing that is particularly noticeable and that stands out considerably with this picture is sort of like the hallmark of this picture is, and let me see if I can get my on camera, is this right there. Okay. You often are looking for what does a person interpret that as being and why. Some people see it as a toy. I'm not going to say most people, but a lot of people see it as a gun. Um, and one thing people will notice about if they see it as a gun, um, there's a couple things to notice about if someone's one is do they see it as a gun? If they see it as a gun, that's not necessarily a problem because for most people it probably does look like a gun, although it's not clear cut. So you want to look at the question isn't so much does a person see it as a gun, but what do they do with that? And part of the thing about it, and let me make sure I'm saying this right, is it's rather it's rather vague, um, but um, for the most part, people who choose to see it as a gun also need to take note of which way is it pointing. Like the person is slumped over, um, but it doesn't look like they're dead. It doesn't look like the first thing a lot of people see as far as perceptions. It doesn't look like they shot themselves necessarily. There's not a lot of indication of blood. The gun is also pointing away. Like the gun, if most people will notice, even if it's a simplistic interpretation, that if the person were to have shot themselves, the gun should have been behind them. Um, the idea being that if the person had shot themselves in the head, the gun would have fallen, but the barrel would have been pointing towards them. So it's pretty. What I'm saying is, for what a lot of people interpret in this picture is, the barrel seems to be pointing away from the person, and most people interpret that in just a very simplistic crime analysis perspective that suggested that the person was pointing the gun towards somebody and not towards themselves. Neither one is necessarily right. It just is a question of um, what does a person see there. So let's talk. Okay, so I'm going to keep this up on the screen. All right, let's start first with perceptual integration. Okay, and remember, perceptual integration is how does a person see this as a whole? Um, what do they take in here? Um, and is there an ignoring of basic emotions here? So this person looks at the picture. The first thing you want to ask is, what does their answer say about how they've taken in this whole picture? Um, what is their kind of, sometimes the word gestalt is used. What is the gestalt that they have to this picture? One thing that, so this, and I like starting as far as perceptual integration goes. Um, I like starting here. I like starting as far as giving discussions of how to interpret the test. I like starting here in part because that's where this issue of this comes in. It's not, does a person see it as a gun? Does a person see it as a toy? Does a person see it as a toy gun? It's, do they incorporate it? Um, or is it possible that they just bypass it? You know, in the first, when we saw that example from the, when we saw that example of the administration from the first class here, um, one thing that a lot of people took note of and was useful to take note of was they seemed to ignore the violin in the picture. Like they just sort of bypassed it or described it as a book, even though most people see it as clearly being a violin. Um, and and I bring that up because this is how you kind of use the TAT as a test, because you will notice in the guidelines in the sort of um, set of steps that Toglisi brings up in the book. Um, there's sections for each card because that's something you want to um, that is something you want to keep in mind. It's not like if the it's not like you interpret any one card just by itself as far as coming to grips with what's going on with the person, but you um, but you look for patterns. And one card number one in this one is a good one to see a pattern you would expect to see. Because if you notice that the person sort of ignores or misinterprets the violin in the first one and then just sort of bypasses this in this one, you're starting to get a sense of a person who, for whatever reason, sort of leaves out the major factors that could prompt any sort of emotional response that could be key to really having to think through or perceive how this person is feeling. Um, Maybe turn it into a more neutral thing or just ignore it altogether. Um, the number one and number three, this one, are also good because um, they both have a pretty. It's hard not to see them as sad. Um, the next two that I'm going to show you, and let me just make sure I'm getting, well, no, um, or it's hard not to see them as sad about something having just happened. Um, and I'll explain what I mean when I show the third one, but the third example I'm going to have here. But these are two where clearly something is happening in the moment or has just happened that seems to be sad. So what you're looking for is, does the person tell a story that seems to reflect some degree of sadness? Are they sort of incorporating this as a whole in a way that suggests that something sad has just happened? In the first card, the kid's, clearly very upset about whatever he's being told to do with the violin. And in this case, something has just happened. Now, for the sake of argument, or for the sake of making the rest of this discussion flow better. Let's assume that that's a gun. Let's assume someone sees that as a gun. So the question then becomes, does the person tell a story that takes into account what might have happened with the gun and why this person um, is slumped over? So let me go back to what I said before about how the gun and some of the factors this picture does not the the first thing you may think is the person shot themselves. And if you process it to any degree, it doesn't look like that's the case. It looks more like they aimed the gun at somebody else. So, one perceptual integration factor you may be looking for here is, do they go immediately to saying this person shot themselves? Or is there sort of processing where maybe it's upon further reflection looks more like they shot somebody, they shot away from them, they shot at something or at someone. So the reason why that's relevant for interpreting this card is you kind of go with, okay, does it look like they have a tendency to go with their first thought to just kind of take the immediate emotional reaction to what's going on there, or does it look like they process through um different factors before they respond emotionally, uh, or before they respond to emotional factors in a process. So, is there tendency to be more emotional, more quick? I'm sorry, more quick in their emotional response, or is there some sense that they process through all the aspects of a picture before they give you some sort of emotional or some sort of description of what might have led to what is clearly an emotional picture. So that's the perceptual integration. Also, again, what you're looking for with perceptual integration is, does it seem to make sense, or do they seem to focus just on certain factors? And if they seem to focus more on just certain factors of a picture, what are those factors? Do they just focus on what's in the foreground? In this case, just being the person slumped over. Do they seem to um, focus on irrelevant factors, uh, like just on the gun? Do they see the gun and then that's all they're focused on? And then you also want to get a sense. I keep going back to emotion because you do want to have some sort of sense of, does there seem to be a reasonable emotional whole to what they're saying here? Do they describe this um, as a sad scene, or do they describe it as a comedy? Um, if they describe it as a comedy, that's not necessarily wrong, but you want to try to get a sense of what are they doing. Like, it'd be hard to see how somebody would see this picture as funny. Um, so if they are describing it as funny, you want to get a sense of, and remember that you're not just asking them to describe the picture, you're asking them to describe what happened, what is the person feeling, and what happens next. And so if they're describing it as funny, you want to try to get a sense of, well, how did they come to that? Um, given that the you know, given that this seems to be a sad picture from most people's perspective, how did they get to funny? What is it they're integrating from this picture that that seems to be funny? One example is uh this is one I had some time ago, was an individual who described this picture as, oh, he's cracking up because he just pointed the gun at his friend who wasn't paying attention, and the gun went off, and a thing came out. Well, it's one of those guns that comes out with a flag that says bang, and now he's cracking up um, there. Now, notice what that would say, that it's not, it it's it's it goes along, it's not necessarily out of the realm of possibility. If you look at this picture, you can't tell what's on the person's face. So it is possible they are slumped over laughing. So it's not like a it it's not it's not discrepant, which is one of the words that's used in the book. It's not discrepant. It's not totally out of the realm of possibility that that person could be laughing. Um, it's probably more what would be called imprecise. And notice what it suggests about the person is it go pretty far to make it funny. Notice, and the reason I brought that up, what was particularly noteworthy about what the person saw there was, um, they said it's one of those guns that says bang. Well, notice there's nothing there that suggests that any of those flags came out that says bang. Um, so, and the person when they told the story didn't mention what happened to the flag. Um, uh, they kind of made reference to it's there, it's just in the shadow. But notice that's going pretty far. So what that would suggest, what that sort of imprecise response would suggest is the person is going pretty far to avoid making this a sad situation. That's sometimes what you get with perceptual integration. It may be the person's cognitive functioning where they're um, either responding very quickly to the first thing that comes to their head and sort of spouting that out there, sort of like an ADHD type of thing, or it may be that they're taking in um, irrelevant or minor parts of the picture, which would be more of perceptual difficulties that you might see with someone with an intellectual disability or possibly remnants of schizophrenia, again, one of the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. Or it could be somebody who is having such difficulty with emotion that they'll go to pretty heavy length to prevent themselves from having to admit that there's anything negative in what they're perceiving. Okay, now the next one is um, uh, concrete versus abstract um, thinking there. And really, all you get there is with concrete versus abstract thinking, there's not even an attempt in a lot of parts of the story to tie everything together. That it's more just naming things. There's a person, there's a couch, there's a gun, um, and there's not in a that's more concrete. Just um, the less concrete it is, the more abstract it is. And abstract means that you can um, tie these things together with stuff that isn't even there. You know, um, a more concrete description is one where the person just names each part, and that's literally true. I mean, that's what's there. There's a couch, there's a person, there's what appears to be a gun there. Um, but in order to make it a story, you have to have some degree of abstract thinking. And concrete versus abstract thinking can reflect either an intellectual or cognitive difficulty where the person just can't think on an abstract level, or it reflects uh, an unwillingness to put forth any effort towards tying things together. It could be that the person's angry at having to take the test and is resistant to making any sort of as abstract thought about it, uh, or it could mean that they just are incapable. Again, schizophrenia, this happens a lot. The person is just so overwhelmed by what's going on in their head that they can't even start to pull together a way to make a story. Okay, so that's more of the cognitive stuff. Let's move on to the information processing part. Okay, when you get to information processing, it's one of the, I mean, there's a number of things as it's described in the book, but one of the things that often um, comes about that sort of pops up as part of the story is, does the story that the person tells of what happens there reflect more immediate gratification, or does it reflect that there was some sort of planning involved? If, for instance, um, this is a story that the person tells about someone having shot um, at someone or at something, there's two factors to keep in mind. What is the story the person tells the reason that the shooting happened? Did it happen because of something that was going on immediate and sort of justified, like the person felt they were in danger? Was it a crime of passion? Maybe they caught their spouse or partner in a relationship with someone, or was it something that was planned? And then also another uh, so the idea of immediate gratification, what does um, the story say about the motivation or about what factors entered into the shooting? Um, what was involved? Like I said, was it immediate gratification? Uh, let me pull that up for a little bit more. And also, you want to know what happened. Did the other person die? Is the other person still there? Um, what was the person's outcome of what happened after the shooting? And the reason why the part about what happens next is pretty noticeable here, or pretty important, is because of how dramatic this all seems. Something just happened. Does the person end up paying a price for it? Does the person end up going to jail? Or does the person end up getting away with it? And what you're looking for here is a sense of not just does a story make sense, that's the perceptual integration part of it, but a little bit more of um, why do dramatic behaviors like this happen? Dramatic behavior being, of course, the shooting. Why do they happen? Is it more an immediate um, thing? Was it planned out? Um, was it partially planned out? Maybe they thought they were expecting. How do things like shooting someone happen? And then what are the outcomes for things like shooting? Um, are there are there consequences, or does the person get away with it? So you're moving beyond does the story make sense as far as perceptual integration, and more of um, what is the person's answer to the question of why do things like this happen? Okay, and then that leads into the emotional uh, part of the story. Why do things like this happen? Enters into the question of how does the person interpret the world? How does the person interpret factually? Why do things like that happen? But then you're moving now into the emotional part of it. What are the primary emotions that you think um, come up here? Was the person and really, there's a couple emotions you would expect to happen in a scene like this: sadness, regret over what just happened, anger if the person caught someone or felt threatened, fear. What you're looking for here is not necessarily are those emotions part of the story, but what you're looking for is what is given primacy. Sadness, anger, fear are all emotions you could see being part of this picture. The question is which one comes up first, um, and which one seems to be emphasized um, more than others. So that's the emotion. You're looking for a real sense of what emotions are emphasized, which emotions come up, and which seem to be downplayed uh, more. What you also want to look here from an emotional aspect here is, does the person seem to recognize that mood and affect can influence intent, but doesn't necessarily impact on outcome? You know, they may have been angry at the person, but is there a recognition that um, that because they were angry and felt like they wanted uh, to shoot a person but didn't want to kill them doesn't mean they wouldn't kill them. So there's a question of emotions. Um, Emotions affect intent, but emotions don't necessarily affect outcome. And this is an interesting thing for thinking about any therapeutic um, uh, approach that you might want to take for a person, because that's often one of the key elements of therapy is getting the person to recognize that there's a difference between how you feel and what you do. So feel is tied up with emotions and intent. Um, uh, Outcome is more a decision making process. You know what you are going to do um, with emotion. So you want to look for this whole picture there is, and this is true in any cards, but it seems to come up even more so with this one is, does the person recognize that there's a difference between emotions impacting intent and then what the outcome would be, that emotions and intent aren't necessarily 100% connected up with outcome. You can feel a certain way and have an intent to do something. Maybe the person's intent was just probably the most common way to look at this is the person may tell a story. A particularly healthy story to this would be um, that they were angry at a partner for having an affair. They put the gun to try to scare them, but accidentally the gun went off and they shot the person. Now, that's a sad story, but it's actually considered to be a particularly healthy one from an emotional point of view. Because notice what, oh, and now the person feels regret. That's the other part of it. Because notice it has regret, which you would expect. It has anger at at the partner cheating on them. Um, and it recognizes that there's a distinction between how you feel emotionally, what your intent is, those tend to be connected, but that the outcome may be completely different. In this case, the person having the intent of scaring the other person, of scaring their partner, but ending up killing them. Uh, that actually would be an emotionally healthy story because it has that recognition of things. Not the person tells it and they're laughing about it. That would be unhealthy from a perceptual integration point of view, and clearly something's sort of disconnected with their integration of this material and how they feel emotionally. Okay, and then moving on to the relationships part of this, this would be the object relations, how the person views connections between people. Um, the story I told you before um, about the healthy storyline being one where this person saw their partner having an affair, confronted them with the gun, intended to scare them, but ended up by shooting them by accident and accidentally killing them, and now they're feeling remorse about it. Um, uh, that would also be healthy from a relationship point of view because a person feels hurt and angry and feels that sort of disconnect, feels a healthy relationship would suggest that this person is connected enough with the other person that they could feel hurt by the other person cheating on them. Um, you know, sort of an unhealthy view of the relationship um, would be if this was a if this was described as suicide. If this was described as suicide, there would be a number of factors wrong with it. Again, the perceptual integration part of it, but also the relationship point of view. Because remember what, because think about what that says about this. It says this person was hurt by someone else, clearly hurt in a way that most people would be hurt by, but their response was to hurt themselves. And this that would tie into the old psychoanalytic saying that depression is anger turned inward. And that would be a reflection of the person taking that point of view. That what they're doing here is um, turning their anger at the other person inward on them. By the way, I think this is important to point out here. Um, um, Saying that the person killed themselves in this picture and that they were doing that as a response to being hurt by someone else doesn't necessarily mean that that's a the way that the person views suicide. I mean, suicide in reality is a very complex concept, and people don't necessarily kill themselves just because something terrible has happened to them. But this is a story that the person is making up, and stories are different from how we view reality. Even if we know intellectually that suicide isn't explained easily by just someone hurt you, so you shoot yourself, doesn't mean that the story the person tells may not come up that way, and that the person may not tell a story about a person killing themselves because they uh, were hurt by someone. But notice what that says emotionally. The emotional response that the person says to being hurt by someone else is to then hurt themselves. And that's a somewhat unhealthy way of viewing relationships and dealing emotionally with factors in relationships. Okay, and then the last part that would be there would be motivation. And that would come to the story. You know, that would be this whole thing of um, regardless of what the motivation is, because remember, we just talked about how the motivation for the shooting could be impacted by emotional factors or views of relationships. The motivation part is just is there clarity to how um, um, what motivated the person to do this. Going back to the healthy story that I told about how there hadn't been um, a that a healthy story would be okay. The person got angry because their partner was having an affair with someone, so they pulled out a gun to scare them and ended up accidentally shooting the person. What's missing from there, as I've told the story so far, that you're looking for the motivation is then what happened. So what you're looking for in here is somewhere in the story that the person tells, they partially answer the question of motivation. The motivation for pulling out the gun was to scare them. But then the rest of it is, well, then what happened? Why did they kill the person? Um, Now, in a motivation, I mean, in a healthy storyline, it would be something like they just got so angry that they lost all focus on what they were doing and they ended up pulling the trigger and killing them. Or they said to themselves, I'm going to just scare them. I'm going to just scare them. But then said in a brief moment of losing control, they said, "To heck with it! I'm just going to kill them," and shot them. Um, and um, so that's the motivation. So what did happen? So the motivation is You know, the emotional part may be, like I said, leading to intent, and the relationship may be what led up to it. The motivation is why then did what happened happen? And then what happens next and what leads to that. By the way, one other thing that can enter into the whole thing with relationship and motivation is who got shot. If this was an example of the story being that um that a partner was killed who was having an affair, um did they end up shooting just the partner? And what happened to the other person? Did they end up shooting them both? And then the question with relationship, why did they both have to suffer in the picture? Why did they both have to die? And if only one of them was shot and died, who was it? And what was the reason that that person was the one again was aimed at? Um, and as far as motivation goes, what happened to the other person? Did they run away? Um, did the person just put down the gun and say, go and leave? You're looking as far as motivation goes for if someone ended up being hurt, um, was the actor being the main person being talked about in the picture, was the main response from the actor to be, well, I made a mistake, but I'm going to just stop here? Or was the response to say, heck with it, everybody's dying. If I made one mistake, I'm just gonna go full gangbusters and shoot every and have everybody shot in the picture. And then what can come up with relationship is if you are hurt by someone, what then happens? Do you then look to hurt the other person, or do you look to hurt the person on the or do you look to hurt the person who was involved, um, but not the main actor? So if you're in a relationship with someone and they hurt you, do you look to hurt them back, or do you look to hurt someone else rather than direct your anger at where it goes? Again, the healthier part of this story, if the person accidentally shot someone, is that their gun was pointed at the person who was cheating on them. Because that would suggest that the anger was directed towards the person who hurt them. If the gun had been pointed at the other person that they were in a relationship with, that would be that at all costs you have to avoid directing your anger at the person who actually hurt you if you're already in a relationship with them. That people you quote unquote love or people you feel connected with, that relationship has to be protected at all costs, even if they hurt you. Okay, so that's just a lot of factors that come up in this one picture. I know we're getting towards the end here. What I'd like you to do is I'm going to show you the next two cards. And what I'd like you to do is, and I'll make this the discussion uh, post to a certain in some way for this. I'd like you to post what your questions are about interpreting, after this lecture, what additional questions you have about what would you be looking for? And then other people can answer them, or you can all just post your own questions and I'll try to answer them in the next discussion board. I mean, in the next video lecture. Um, but just to show you, and I know we have a few minutes here, but I'm not going to be able to get into as much detail with the other ones. Um, this is the next card I was going to look at. This is card number 4. Um, Now, this is the one, okay, now as far as perceptual integration goes, you want to look for a story that's clearly tying together something emotional going on between these two. But it's not as so the perceptual integration here would be more focused on is the emotions coming about but in the relationship between these two individuals. Um, Unlike before, where the perceptual integration was had to do with one individual and an object. So there's not necessarily going to be a relationship between the two main aspects of the picture because one of them is an object. So you're kind of, the person's kind of having to generate their own story of what's going on off screen. Here, there's not as much need to pull things off screen because you have the two main actors in the story right here. So the perceptual integration isn't necessarily one emotion being necessarily more expected than the other, but does the emotion come about between the interaction between these two? The concrete versus abstract thinking would be, there's one man, there's a man and a woman, and she's holding on to him. That would be the concrete. The abstract would be building more to that. What is going on here? When you get to the information um, processing aspect of this, um, when you get to the information processing uh, part of this, let me point out another part of information processing that particularly comes up with this picture. This is really where you will, if you're going to get a response from the person about how they feel about the test, being bored or irritated or happy that things changed, this is where you're going to get it because the first three pictures have a darker, sad quality to them, or so they either go from neutral to sad. This one seems to have a little bit more action going on in it. So, because it changes up a little bit, this is where the information part about the person complaining about this test being boring, um, or having been annoyed by the other pictures. You might get that here because you might get the person um, talking about how they're happy things changed. Or when you go to the next one, which is this picture, the switch from here, from this picture to the next picture, which is this one, or one of the next pictures, which is this one, can be where you get this, the person complaining about being bored or where they're saying, oh my gosh, not this again, or something like that. Like really being caught off, really being bothered by what you're asking them to do and being verbal about it and sort of being impulsive in their statements about it. Um, so information, and then when you get to the emotional and relationship, that's really where this card stands out because you got a lot of chance here to see how the person defines relationships between two individuals and what do they see going on here, and how do they define relationships between it. So the relationship and emotional part really stand out in this card. You're really looking here for a lot of discussion of relation of factors that you can use to interpret relationships and emotion. And along that same line, this tells you about relationships by people who are interacting with each other and still interacting with each other and what that means emotionally. This next card is sort of, well, what happens in the aftermath? What happens when there are problems in the relationships? What happens when the relationships are over? According to my clock, I've gone for about an hour. So I'm going to stop here. But like I said, I'm going to pick this up next week. And I'd really like you in I'm going to make the discussion board post this week. You bringing up your questions that you still have about interpreting the test, and I will try to answer all of them for the next video lecture.